We'll start with the year 1796. It was in this year that Napoleon married for the first time. He married the famous and beautiful Josephine. At this point, she was perhaps most famous because she had been the mistress of the revolutionary leader Barras, one of the great leaders of revolutionary France after Robespierre. But Barras had tired of Josephine for his own reasons, and so Josephine was seen not only as somebody beautiful for Napoleon to marry, who he probably did have real affection for, but it was also a good political move for him to marry her. After all, she had connections to some of the highest sources of power in revolutionary France. But yet, just 2 days after their marriage, rather than go on a honeymoon together, Napoleon left alone to go and try to conquer Italy for the revolution. The war had already raged throughout various Italian states. There was no Italy yet at this point. It had raged primarily against the Austrians, who had various interests and places that they were allied with throughout Italy as well. But still, this was a place that the French were losing quickly, and the revolution had not taken there as they had hoped. It's also curious because we have Napoleon as a Corsican going to a land that in many ways he was probably more closely related to. It was also, of course, the land that had produced the great empire of Rome, something that Napoleon desperately wanted to recreate. And so it was ideal really for him and for his early campaigns. When he came down there, he found an army of some 30,000 troops who had not been paid in months, who only had 60 cannons in their employ, and who themselves had largely ragged clothing and largely hungry faces. And so Napoleon turned to inspiring them. He said, quote, "Soldiers, you are naked, ill-fed. But rich provinces and great towns will soon be in your power, and in them you will find honor, glory, and wealth. Soldiers of Italy, will you be wanting in courage and steadfastness to obtain these things?" In other words, he inspired them to pillage. He inspired them to take what was supposedly rightfully theirs. Wasn't. It was somebody else's land. And he called this whole thing glory. He even calls them soldiers of Italy. They were largely French revolutionaries. There were some Italians who were in the army as well, but they were largely French. He calls them soldiers of Italy to give them a whole new identity, an identity that they will have to conquer to actually make good on. Of course, it worked brilliantly. He ultimately was able to defeat the Austrians, who vastly outnumbered him in northern Italy, and began to divide Italy into various city-states, ultimately placing himself as president over these things. He ultimately was able to destroy the Austrians as well because he was known for his quick movements on the battlefield, his ability to quickly make decisions, his boldness in crossing rivers that the enemy would not actually cross, as well as the trickery he used against the Austrians. He would often send little detachments of scouts to pop up on different sides of the battlefield, especially above hilltops, to convince the Austrians they were surrounded by a superior force. We'll see the same things at work, for example, or you may have already in your study of the U.S. Civil War, and especially the tactics of Stonewall Jackson. Montgomery would do the same thing in Africa against the Germans. At one point, for example, in the campaign of Napoleon in Italy, some 3,500 of his French, who had been separated from the rest of their army, managed to hold off a single bridge against some 10,000 Habsburg troops of Austria. These kinds of heroic and daring and dashing events all made their way back to the revolutionary papers of France, and the people loved it. Napoleon was quickly becoming a celebrity and quickly becoming the actual effective person who could create the revolution wherever he went, it seemed, meaning he could conquer in the name of the revolution.